Let me explain to you something that you clearly don't know. Now, I'm going to ask you to believe 100% of what I'm about to rant about because all of your information about what evolution derives from is merely creation extremist words, which have a history of making false claims and poor resources for you to use, as I've proven throughout this series. This is not my definition. This is a global definition of what evolution is and how it works, in point form. Evolutionism really doesn't exist. You see, evolutionism was actually conjured up by theists who really didn't understand it. Putting ism at the end of evolution implies that it is a religious concept or a belief, which it is not. Evolution is discovery, not a point of view, a perspective, or a belief. It is absolutely 100% out there for us to test, see, replicate, and be a part of. In fact, all of science is this. The reason we have evolutionary theory, or theory of relativity, is just how our top minds in the world can explain these perfectly evident events. Evolution happened way before mankind. It will happen way after mankind, and it is happening during and to mankind. This is a big point that you do not understand. Humans did not create or come up with evolution. We only came up with how to explain it. This is why scientists are able to falsify other scientists' words and work. It's not that the previous ones lied, it's that the previous ideas were mildly flawed. Then, a new scientist comes in and solves these flaws to make a better, more accurate explanation. You can never prove evolution wrong, because evolution is an intrinsic property of life. The only thing you can prove wrong is how humans have interpreted evolution to be, which you personally still have not been able to even touch the surface of. Now, I did mention that we can test evolution and replicate it. Here are a few great examples on how we've been able to do this and prove evolution. The domesticated silver fox is a result of nearly 50 years of experiments in Russia to domesticate the silver morph of the red fox. I'll be explaining how in a more simple way. At first, the experiments were being done in the Central Research Laboratory of Fur Breeding in Moscow in 1948. The breeding project was set up by the Soviet scientist Dmitry Belyaev, who used to be the head of the Department of Fur Animal Breeding at the Central Research Laboratory of Fur Breeding in Moscow. He lost his job because of his commitment to classical genetics. During the 1950s, however, he continued to conduct genetic research under the guise of studying animal physiology. This was more acceptable to the Communist Party, which wanted to improve humans. Belyaev believed that the key factor selected for domestication of dogs was not size or reproduction, but behavior, specifically amenability to domestication or tameability. To put it in an extremely simplified way, take one dog that has a trait that you like, take another that has a similar trait, and breed them together to produce the next generation, sometimes carrying the same trait, but the potential of that trait being stronger. Then, take the offspring of the second generation that are most improved and interbreed them with the parents or other siblings. The third generation would sometimes have an even stronger version of that trait. Then keep repeating. But because of generation-to-generation interbreeding, some side effects were being seen. The new foxes not only became more tame, but more dog-like as well. They lost their distinctive musky fox smell, became more friendly with humans, put their ears down like dogs, wagged their tails when in certain emotional states, and began to vocalize and bark like domesticated dogs. Some important changes in physiology and morphology are now visible, such as mottled or spotted colored fur, which they never had before, aka new information, floppy ears, curly tails, and changes in skulls that were unusually broad for their length. Another example of testing and replicating evolution would be in 1993. Theodore Gerald Jr. and colleagues started a long-term experiment that involved selective breeding for high voluntary activity levels on running wheels with mice. This experiment also continues to this day, with over 50 generations. Mice from the 4 replicate high runner lines evolved to run 3 times as many running wheel revolutions per day as compared with the 4 unselected control mice groups, mainly by running faster than control mice for more minutes a day. The high runner mice exhibit an elevated maximal aerobic capacity when tested on a motorized treadmill and a variety of other traits that appear to be adaptations that facilitate high levels of sustained endurance running. For example, larger hearts and more symmetrical hind limb bones. They also exhibit alterations in motivation and the reward system of the brain. These are both great examples of microevolution. For anyone to think theoretically and had no perception of evolution, one may come up with the conclusion that because of these new bone structures and appearances, they would eventually, after many upon many of generations, could potentially be so different from their ancestors that it would be classified as something totally different. Animals of domestic origin and feral ones sometimes can produce fertile hybrids with native wild animals, which lead to genetic pollution in the naturally evolved wild gene pools, many times threatening rare species with extinction. Cases include the Muller duck, wildcat, wild boar, the rock dove or pigeon, the red jungle fowl, which are ancestors of all chickens, carp, and more recently, salmon. A feral organism is one that has escaped from domestication and returned partly or wholly to its wild state. The introduction of feral animals or plants, like any introduced species, can disrupt ecosystems and may, in some cases, contribute to extinction of indigenous species. Feral population can have a significant impact on the ecosystem by predation on vulnerable plants or animals, or by competition with indigenous species. Feral plants and animals constitute a significant share of invasive species, and can be a threat to endangered species. What does this all mean? Natural selection. Yes, there was human intervention. However, the explosion in population of very dominant species that is slowly, yet quickly, and sometimes accidentally, introduced to an environment with other organisms can cause great effects to other organisms. Take the cane toad, for example. They originate in South America, but have been introduced to many ecosystems around the world. One example is in Australia, which is a foreign country to the cane toad. It was introduced there to help keep down the population of cane beetle. However, these cane beetles differed from other species because they stayed on top of the sugarcane plants where the cane toads could not reach them. Cane toad females lay 8 to 35,000 eggs at a time and may produce 2 clutches a year. They have glands on the back of their necks that have a toxic substance in which nearly every Australian species could be killed by if ingested. These pictures are of Australia. In the black, you can see the population of cane toads from 1940 to 1980. This is still a case of natural selection, which is an intrinsic property of evolution. As you can see, none of these tests ever contradicted anything else you so claimed they would have. All these incidences are proof of minor mutations in the animals put through these tests. Granted, the first 2 examples were controlled experiments. However, they still show mutation, not because of human intervention, but through breeding. The incidences are simply a sped-up version of evolution in the wild. This is something that might interest you. I can prove evolution using Genesis. Someone may ask, if Adam and Eve were the first humans on Earth, then how did so many ethnic groups come about? This question starts with an assumption, that Adam and Eve were the first people on Earth. If there is no way to explain the ethnic diversity that exists, then that assumption must be revised. One of the usual parameters of that assumption are that Adam and Eve were created approximately 4004 BCE, although some extended this time frame to around 10,000 BCE. So, the evolution of separate ethnic groups must have evolved between 4004 or 10,000 BCE, in the time that we can first identify diversity. But another usual parameter is that the Great Flood killed all the humans except Noah and his family. The Bible tells us that the flood occurred around 2350 BCE. Now, the evolution of separate ethnic groups must be evolved between 2350 BCE and the time when we could first identify ethnic diversity, regardless of when Adam and Eve are believed to live. There's no reasonable doubt that ethnic diversity has existed on Earth long before 2350 BCE, and even before 4004 BCE, or 10,000 BCE. We know that Australian Aboriginals have occupied Australia, isolated from all human societies, for up to 50,000 years, long before the flood. Their ethnic diversity predates the biblical stories. Even in the Middle East, archaeologists can identify quite separate groups who've lived long before these dates. Since Adam and Eve are biblical characters, we first need to refer to other aspects of the biblical data for a complete answer. Modern science, together with sociology, also has some good answers to this very good question. If we understand the principles of genetic inheritance, we can also understand how every skin color on Earth can be developed from 2 mid-brown individuals. This is known in practice when 2 people, themselves a progeny of a white and black person, have a child. They themselves can have children of either white or black appearance or initiate in between. This explains why Africans are still Africans. The reason for this is the way social groupings, aided by relevant language barriers in many cases, tend to stay isolated from persons who are different and are possibly therefore taboo as eligible marriage partners. Thus, it is not merely a matter of genetics that accounts for differences. What matters is that certain populations have become isolated and become specialized and restricted to a particular skin color, which again explains why Africans are still Africans. If the Bible is in fact true, then evolution would still occur. And if it's mentioned in the Bible, it must be true.